Gonna do that. Now we do that. All right. So, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the first year AISIG meeting, or this is the first AISIG meeting of the year. We're going to try to do this on a regular basis. I know we've been kind of stepping along, trying to figure out how to get it going, but we've got some pretty good activities coming up in the next few months. So upcoming meetings, upcoming events, we're going to have on the 27th, we're going to have an AISIG member image highlight night. So basically, we're going to see if we can convince folks like Michael Sherman to share their favorite images, describe their equipment and the processes they use to create what they did. So hopefully we'll get some folks up here that want to share what they've done. We're looking forward to it. On April 24th, Russ Croman of RC Astro has decided that he's going to go ahead and join us. And Russ Croman is the developer of all the AI magic that's been coming up in PixInsight. He has made a great deal of what happens in PixInsight completely automatic. And if you haven't seen what Blur Exterminator does, the version 4 of Blur Exterminator, as far as deconvolution and setting up stars, is just absolutely amazing. It also takes my poor old computer and drags it into the weeds. So I'm in the process of picking out a new computer just because his processes are incredibly processor intensive, but they do just an amazing job of processing. Star Exterminator, the amount of the processing abilities once you get the stars out of the picture is it's hugely expansive. So that's been a whole lot of fun to learn that. So he'll be with us on the 24th. I've got a few other folks in the back. Also, we're planning on doing a Fix Your Pix night where those that have had problems processing can take their images, and we'll figure out as a group the best way we might be able to help them get things solved. So that's what's coming up. Ooh, hit the wrong button. So tonight, guest speakers, Greg Crinklaw, owner of Skyhound. Those of us that have been using his software for a long time know this amazing piece of software. SkyTools, I think I got my hands on the second edition of SkyTools. And it has been just an absolute great piece of software to use for imaging and target selection and stuff like that. Greg has come out with SkyTools 4 in 2 versions. Hopefully he'll give us a good rundown on what those things do, but it's truly amazing. Greg, thank you very much for coming. Screen is all yours.
Okay. Appreciate you inviting me, David, and everybody else. Uh-oh, got a cough. Yeah, so tonight I want to sort of talk about multiple things. The first is SkyTools imaging. There's a new version out, so I want to talk about that and cover a little bit about what it is for those who aren't familiar. But I also want to talk about some general principles that I've learned from developing the software and using it and testing it that anybody could use. So let's share my screen.
And by the way, folks, feel free to jump in and ask questions. Hey, we've got a small group, but in this particular setting, if you've got any questions that come along, please ask.
Let's see. I've been sitting here too long. To get started, well, let's do this. There it goes. So I try to always show this picture I took because, why wouldn't I? I took this in 2020, summer of 2020 of NeoWise. And actually it's a bunch of stack of images of the comet. The comet moved down and to the right like this. And this was taken from here in Cloudcroft. We have a overlook that overlooks the Tularosa Basin where White Sands is. And that's a great place to see comets in the evening. You can see them down really, really close to the horizon. So I set up the telescope there with a bunch of other people. We were all doing our best to try to stay away from each other as best as possible. And I took this series of images, and on the very last image, of course, there's these clouds coming in the whole time. And I wasn't happy about it, but at least they weren't on top of the comet, right? But I think they added a really nice effect. And the very last image caught that lightning there. And it took me over a year to process this image to the way I wanted it. But I'm pretty happy with it. And the lesson from this image for me is that I bought the camera just a few months before. And I always wanted just a regular DSLR for, it's just a TI7, Canon TI7, just a cheap DSLR. I wanted one for photography, and I bought it, and I started thinking, well, can I use this for astrophotography? And my thought was, if I can, I better figure it out soon, because you never know when a comet's going to come along. And that was probably April of 2020. And so I bought the camera. I started to learn how to use it. I bought myself a tracking mount because I discovered that short exposures didn't work really well. 15-second exposures on track. Bought a tracking mount, didn't like it, sent it back, got another tracking mount. And then 2 weeks after that, this thing moved into the evening sky. And by then, I knew what to do. So this is a lesson in preparedness, even if it was at the last minute. If I hadn't, I remember thinking, why am I spending so much time trying to figure out how to use this camera? And this is why. But I also want to use this as an excuse to plug my comet chasing YouTube channel. I've had a webpage, a comet chasing webpage for 22 years now. And it's unique in that it's not as glossy and as other more recent comet web pages that are sometimes done by people who don't really know that much about comets. But it's got a lot of really useful information. And the main thing that it provides is it can tell you how big of a telescope you need under typical conditions, suburban, to see a comet. And that turns out to be a very difficult calculation. And really only SkyTools can make that calculation. And I use SkyTools to do that. But moving on, I forgot to mention, I'm going to talk about EAA right at the end, if anybody's interested in that. So hang in there. So this is me way, way back. That is the 40-inch telescope at Mount Laguna. I went to San Diego State University as an undergraduate. That's me as a graduate student. And I hung off the side of that telescope for 4 hours for 3 different exposures, 4 hours at a time, guiding the darn thing, standing on top of a ladder, sliding it a little to the left as the telescope moved, rotating the dome, all from the top of the ladder. And boy, we got it easy today compared to that. And that was because at the time we were waiting for the CCD camera, the first CCD camera on that telescope to be finished. And I thought, well, I had a project, I might as well go ahead and do it the old-fashioned way. And it was the old-fashioned way even at the time. But back then you did long exposures, right? And the longer exposure you did, the better your image. I don't think we could do that today because of all the satellites and airplanes and everything else going on. But I got away with it back then. And we're going to get back to the question of how long of an exposure is a good exposure as we go on here. Because back then, the longer you could expose, the better. And it turns out not much has changed, really. People think it's changed, but it hasn't really changed that much. So here's SkyTools. This is the SkyTools scheduler. And so what SkyTools is used for, you can select suitable targets. You can determine the best time of night to image on a per filter basis. Select the best sub-exposure time, the best gain setting to use, keep track of multi-night projects. And when you're done, you can create an archive of the projects that you've completed. Those are the main functions of the software. And what really makes it unusual is there's software similar to SkyTools out there that's used at big giant observatories around the world, but they tend to work for one telescope. I love this image, by the way. This is an AI idea of what a wide variety of imaging telescopes would look like. I don't see a single camera, although maybe that's a camera. I'm not really sure. And I don't know what that is. And that's just awesome. Anyhow, this is the representation of a wide variety of telescopes used for imaging. The thing about SkyTools is it'll do just about anything from a DSLR on a tripod all the way up to, the 200-inch at Palomar, whatever you want. You could even make it do Hubble if you want. I think you can turn off the atmosphere. I hadn't really thought about that. Maybe you can't do Hubble. But each imaging system has its strengths and weaknesses, and you got to sort of play to your strengths on what you've got available, and SkyTools can help you do that. The way it does that, and I'm going to skip through this very quickly. The way it does that is using a scientific model of your imaging system. So that starts with the spectral properties of the target, and then the atmosphere, and the telescope optics, and the filter, and then down to the camera. So this is what the spectrum of the star looks like. This is the wavelengths across the bottom, the color red to blue, general part of the spectrum that our cameras are sensitive to. And you can see that it's brighter over here in the blue than it is in the red, and it trails off. Here's an image of an emission expression. Here is an emission spectrum. We usually work kind of in this area over here. This is the H alpha emission, the O3. And you can see the H alpha is stronger than the O3 in this object. And this is the S2. It's not very strong at all. So you could look at that and you could say, well, maybe you're just going to do the O3 and the H alpha filters because there's not much S2 there. And that's not too far off, but it's not that simple. You can't just look at what's going on there because it turns out there's a lot of other things going on before you get to the detector. The first thing that happens is that light travels clear across the universe to get here, hardly touched, and then it hits the atmosphere, and the atmosphere scatters light, and it scatters and it absorbs it, and it scatters light in a differently depending on the wavelength. So it leaves kind of it changes the colors a little bit. Same thing happens when it goes through your telescope. That magnifies the signal, but it also leaves a stamp on what the final brightnesses will be for each color. Excuse me. Then it goes through your filter, and this is from the software. This is an actual transmission curve for a green filter, and this is the H alpha line. You can see it completely misses, so you're not going to get any H alpha in this green filter. And then this is the O3 line, the main O3 line. You're going to get about half of it because it reaches the transmission at about 50%. The blue filter usually sits right here, and it'll get the other half. But if you don't think about it, it helps to know these things. And SkyTools sort of knows it internally because it has the transmission curve for each of those filters in there. So that allows it to do quite a bit of magic. And then finally, the light reached your detector. And this is a recent CMOS detector. And this is what we call the quantum efficiency, is how sensitive it is over wavelength again. You can see it's sensitive out here in the red. This is about a blue. This is about where the O3 line would be. And then out here where the H alpha is, it's only 50% sensitive. So if you add all those things up, make a big convolution, you can determine how sensitive you are at each of those wavelengths. And that can help you decide how much signal you're going to get on your detector from each of those wavelengths. So that's the first part. That's modeling the signal. The second part is the noise. And there's two kinds of noise. There's the readout noise and the sky noise. And the thing about these two is they take you in different directions as far as the sub-exposure time. So the readout noise, that happens every time you read out the exposure. So if you're going to image for 2 hours, You want to use the longest exposures possible because that way you'll have fewer times that you read out the detector. But for the sky noise, it works just the other way around. If you have significant sky, the longer your sub-exposure is, the more signal you get from the sky, and that means you get more noise. So those two work in opposite directions. One telling you you want short exposures, the other one telling you you want long exposures. But it turns out there's so many other factors. That's not really what you need to be thinking about. And we're going to get to that in a minute. So now that we've got the signal on the detector, we can calculate the noise. We can compute the signal to noise ratio. And the signal to noise ratio is really important because it tells us the quality of the image. And this is actually from a dialogue in the software in version 4.1. And so the higher the signal to noise, let's say 100, the more the signal is overwhelming the noise. But one thing people never talk about is which part of the image are you talking about? Are you talking about the background with mostly sky where there's very little signal? You're not going to have a very high signal to noise ratio there because there's very little signal, right? The brighter parts of your nebula or whatever are going to have a high signal to noise ratio. So when we talk about signal to noise ratio, we need to talk about what part of the object we're talking about. And this sort of gives us a basic idea of what signal to noise ratio means if you're making a pretty picture. This is signal to noise ratio of 4. You can see that's very peppered. If there's something there, it might be hard to convince yourself it really is. At 20, it looks pretty good. You can use noise exterminator or whatever on that and take out a lot of the noise. At 60, it looks pretty darn good, and anything above 60 is going to look better and better. So 20 is what I tend to use as my minimum, especially these days, now that we can take out noise better. So 20 is what I shoot for as my minimum signal to noise for my image. So the first thing we can do with Sky Tools, now we can calculate the signal to noise ratio, is we can determine what to image. What's an acceptable object that will give you a good image. And a big part of that is the image scale. If you have a very small object like this one, let's imagine it covered 4 pixels. Then all the light from that galaxy would go into those 4 pixels, and each pixel would get a quarter of the light. Man. But then you can compare that to this, and you're spreading the light way out over maybe over the entire detector. And in that case, each pixel is going to get a much smaller piece of the light. So that means it's going to appear fainter to that pixel. And that means it's going to take a lot longer to expose. And the only thing you've done is change the image scale, right? This could be the same aperture telescope, same camera or whatever, but we've changed the image scale. So now we spread the light out. So there's this trade-off between the image scale and the brightness of the object and the capabilities of your detector, sensitivity of your system, to find things that are big enough to be interesting, but not so spread out that there isn't enough signal and you have to image for 100 hours to get something, or 1,000 hours. And so that opens up the possibility of finding new objects that other people don't typically image. Instead of imaging M42 over and over or whatever, every time I see M42, I go out and I look up, I wonder how many people are imaging it right now. The first thing it can do is it can tell you whether a target is suitable for your telescope, and then maybe give you some ideas of targets that aren't that common that might also be suitable for your telescope. Second thing it can do is it can tell you when to image, because atmospheric extinction is a real thing, and the farther you go down and down in the sky, the less and less signal you're going to get. And also, if the moon is up, sometimes you can image in a narrowband filter, better some than others. Depends on how far away the moon is, what phase it's in. If you can calculate all that and determine the sky background, then you can determine when it's safe to image, even if the moon's up. So that's the second thing it can do. And here's an example. This is a full night centered on midnight. This red dashed line is the altitude of our target object. This is the altitude of the moon. And this background here is shaded by the color of the sky from our sky model. So this is twilight. It's not fully dark because the moon's up, and then it only gets fully dark here. This blue line is the quality line, and that's really important. It's key to what SkyTools does. If you calculate the signal to noise ratio you can get in a 5-minute exposure under the best positions, best conditions for that telescope at that location, then that would put the blue line clear at the top. So what you can do is you can take whatever the signal to noise ratio is at any given time of the night, and you divide it by the best signal to noise ratio, and it just gives you a simple ratio. So if this blue line is halfway up, that means you're getting half the signal to noise in a 5-minute exposure than you would be if it was at the top. That also means that you're going to have to image or stack twice as long to get the same quality of image. So what this is telling us is that we probably want to image this object here. We definitely don't want to be imaging it at this time of night. So we can define a period of night for each filter for our target that's best to image. And this shows how that changes from one filter to another. These are different filters. Top one's an R filter, and this graphic at the bottom tells us the period of night and sort of summarizes how good it is. And this bright green area is the best part of the night. It's when this blue line's at its highest. You can see for the R filter, it's a pretty good solid piece of the night. But for the L filter, it's a much shorter period of the night. And for the B filter, it's not there at all. That's probably because of the weather conditions that have been selected. It doesn't make it to a really good period of the night. So maybe you might want to wait for another night for that one. And then for the H alpha filter, you get this long period of time because it's not really interfered with by the moon in this configuration that much. So we could use that to schedule, to plan. We could say, well, let's start with the H alpha filter, go to this part of the night, maybe do the R, throw in the L, and maybe leave this one for another part of the night. So that's the first two things that SkyTools can do. And now I'm going to interrupt myself. And I'm going to talk about some general things that I've learned from doing all this modeling of image capture, which is the other end of image processing. You know, there's image capture, there's image processing. You'll get better images, final images, when you process them if you start with high quality images to begin with. And if you're more efficient about how you capture your images, you can get more in less time in terms of your image capture time. So I want to talk about some stacking questions. Is there a point of diminishing returns in stacking your images? Will adding images with lower signal to noise ratio to a stack degrade the total signal to noise ratio? Should you only stack the good ones, like in Lucky Imaging? Can you stack two stacks of images together? And finally, what's the signal to noise ratio of a composite image, like an RGB color or LRGB or Hubble palette? How do you determine the signal to noise ratio of the final image? So starting with the first thing about diminished returns, this can be a little confusing because what happens is people confuse reaching a good enough signal to noise ratio with enough exposure. And it turns out that there is no point of diminished returns. As you expose, so this is a graph of number of sub-exposures versus total signal to noise ratio. And as you can see, you're going to get most of your increase in signal to noise ratio early on, but it's still going up pretty good later on. But look at these numbers over here for the signal to noise ratio. We've reached 100 at this point, and you're not going to see a lot of difference as you go to 400 or 500 signal noise, because you've already killed the noise off at 100. But imagine this was the faint background of the image. You're still going to see a lot of improvement in those fainter areas the more you stack. So there's always reasons to keep adding exposure time and stacking. What about adding the lower signal to noise ratio image into the stack of higher quality, higher signal noise images. Well, this is the formula for adding images together. So here's the signal to noise ratio, the first one, second one, third one, and fourth one. We take the value, we square it, and then we add them together and we take the square root. Well, if this one was really small, it doesn't matter because nothing this can do, it can't go negative. Doesn't matter how small it is, it just won't increase the final signal to noise ratio that much, but it can't hurt it. So in terms of signal to noise ratio only, you can only increase the quality by adding lower quality images. And what that really comes down to is you can add images of different sub-exposure times together if you want. If you've got crappy 60-second exposures and a whole bunch of 300-second exposures, you can go ahead and stack them together. It can't hurt, with the exception of things like saturated stars and things like that. Then it can hurt. Stacking image stacks, well, just looking at all this math here, all it really does is tell us that it doesn't matter. You can stack 50, if you've got 100 images, you can stack 50 of them, and you take the other 50 and stack those, and then you can stack those images together, and you're going to get pretty much the same answer. So how do you determine the signal to noise ratio of a color composite image? And this right here is the formula for determining the color noise. We're all pretty familiar with the color noise, I think, if we do color imaging. And you can see this is the signal to noise ratio of the red component, the green, and the blue. This is a whole different deal. These things are in the denominator. So if this blue, which is the one that's usually the one that'll get you, is smaller than the others, we're going to take the inverse of that, which is going to give us a bigger number. Then we're going to square that bigger number, and it's in the bottom, which means this whole thing is going to get smaller. So what that is saying is the smaller your signal, if you throw in a stack of blue images that has a lower signal to noise ratio than your reds and your greens, it will hurt the final color image. I mean, there's magic you can do to try to minimize it, but what you really want to do is try to get more time on that blue so you don't hurt the overall image. You'll get color noise. And then how do you determine the signal noise ratio, just as an aside, for an LRGB image? Well, you calculate it for the luminance, you calculate it for the color, that's this, and then you put them together in this familiar way. So we can calculate that, which means SkyTools can calculate it. I want to say a few things about sub-exposure times, because I've spent a lot of time on this for the last 10 years. And I think I finally have a good answer. It's a very simple answer for what the proper sub-exposure time is to use. And it works in all instances. Really, I'm not kidding. Longer sub-exposure times are always better. Except when they're not. And I'm going to talk about what that means. But if you have a choice for a longer sub-exposure time, and there's no reason not to do it, take the longer sub-exposure time. Doesn't matter how much light pollution you have. It doesn't matter what camera you have, whether it's CMOS, CCD. Longer is always better in terms of signal to noise. And there's really no such thing as an optimum sub-exposure time. This is something I fell for years ago based on sky-limited exposure times. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So I wanted to make sure all this was right. So I put together a test. And I used this beautiful telescope in Chile. And it's an eye telescope. And I used this target planetary nebula. And what I did is I took two 600-second exposures here, and I stacked them. And over here, we've got 20 60-second exposures. And so they're both the same total exposure time, short exposures, two long exposures. And this may not come through. Don't look at the background here, but let's pick an area with some signal, like right here. That is noisier than it is right here in the longer exposure. And it's noisier by the exact amount that SkyTools predicted. I'll get to that. Yeah. So what SkyTools did is it predicted that, and I went and I used PixInsight to measure the signal noise ratio here and here. And SkyTools predicted that it would be 39% less signal to noise ratio for this image than that one. And the actual measurement was 44%. Or it's the other way around. Either way, they're close enough. It's close enough. So this proved that the SkyTools signal to noise ratio thing actually works. And that underpins the whole idea of longer exposures are better. This is a new feature in SkyTools Imaging 4.1. It's called the exposure table. At the top here, we just have signal to noise ratio. And remember, I liked 20 as a good starting point. And then different regions of your nebula, the brightest, the main part, faint regions, very faint regions. And so we're looking at 20. What this does is it tells us the brightest regions will take 10 minutes to reach the signal to noise ratio of 20, 40 minutes for the main part of the nebula. This was the same planetary nebula. So if we go back, this would be the brightest parts. All this in here would be the main part. Faint part might be way out here. And the very faint part not even showing up in this exposure because it wasn't long enough. So for the faint regions, to really get it in a signal noise ratio of 20, you'd have to actually go 17 hours, it turns out. So when I pointed to those faint regions earlier, that probably wasn't really the faint region because we didn't go anywhere close to 17 hours. 626 to get to the very, very, very faintest parts. So most of the time we're going to image with this imaging system up here in the bright region and the main part. But this table down here is pretty interesting. I call this the sub-exposure time deficit. Now, every calculation ever made for any imaging system always came back that the longest sub-exposure time obtained a higher signal to noise ratio when you did your stacking for the same amount of total time. So here we have the target regions again, brightest, main part, faint, very faint. And then these are the sub-exposure times. Now, for this telescope, these are the allowed sub-exposure times. They go from 30 to 10 minutes, 30 seconds to 10 minutes. That's where they come from. This is the longest sub-exposure time that's allowed. So we're going to set 10 minutes as your reference. If you go to 9 minutes, you lose 1% of your signal to noise ratio. 8 minutes, you lose 2. You go down to 5 minutes, you lose 7%. And that's not total time. Remember, that's sub-exposure time. So for the same total exposure time, you're giving up 7% of your signal to noise ratio. Excuse me. If you go down to 60 seconds, you lose 36% under these conditions for this telescope. And I did all this, by the way, with the moon up. So it was I think it was the Bortle 4 is what the equivalent came to, because this wasn't actually the full dark sky at Chile. But notice also that for each, as you go to fainter regions, it gets worse and worse. So 60-second exposure for the faintest regions, you lose 54% of your signal to noise ratio, which really means you're just losing 54% of your signal. And that's in the final stack. So you can use this to look at it and say, well, I can get away with 5-minute exposures because I'm worried about airplanes. And that's going to mean I'm going to lose 15% in the faint regions. So what is the effect of light pollution on all of this? And the answer is that, because when CMOS cameras came out, a lot of people felt that they gave you more under light polluted conditions. Most people don't believe that so much anymore, but that was the original idea. But it turns out that low read noise for a CMOS camera has the biggest effect on the dark site. When you are imaging in a bright light polluted area and you're not using a narrowband filter or some sort of light pollution cut, a filter that removes it, you can basically go as short as you want with your sub-exposures. If you made this table for a light polluted location, these numbers would hardly go down as you went to shorter for the light pollution. But that's not the same thing as it meaning it's good. It just means that it's going to be uniformly bad. It doesn't really matter what sub-exposure time you use. But the low read noise does have a dramatic effect at dark sites, and it allows you to go to much shorter times with a lower penalty. So if you had a camera with a lower read noise, again, these would go down less as you go to shorter and shorter exposures, although this one already has a fairly low read noise. Okay, so I mentioned the sky limited exposures a little earlier. This has been a common calculation that people have used. I've used it in the past to try to determine what sub-exposure time to use. And it's a flawed calculation. The idea is that you reach a minimum as you increase the sub-exposure times, where the sky will dominate the noise. And then from then on, it doesn't get better. And that's actually absolutely true. But the problem is in the way that people interpret that. By not getting better, because now you're limited by the sky brightness, that doesn't mean it doesn't get better. It does get better, it just gets better slowly. So again, it takes us right back to what I said to begin with. Longer exposures are better. So what the sky limited sub-exposure time is really telling us is the lower limit. If the sky limited sub-exposure is 2 minutes, you need to make sure you take at least a 2-minute exposure, but you could take a 3 or a 5 as long as you don't run into any problems in doing that. And I could go into why this doesn't really work. It's because they decoupled two things that there are actually coupled when they make the calculation. But this is where this is what really determines your sub-exposure time, the practical limits, tracking errors, how often you're going to get satellites. I was looking for a comet on the horizon the other day. Oh my goodness. I mean, it was like something out of a cartoon. There were satellites going through my binocular field of view, left and right, constantly. There were more than one most of the time. And this was right during twilight, of course, when satellites are at their worst. I was down low on the horizon, so I'm seeing the most of them possible. So if you're under those circumstances, if you're not imaging in the middle of the night, satellites are going to be an issue. Maybe you want to go to shorter sub-exposure times. You might live near an airport. Cosmic rays aren't that big a deal anymore, but there's also wind, accidental bumps, bear attacks, whatever. You don't want to do a 10-minute exposure and lose it, right? And of course, you're going to get trailing on targets like comets and minor planets. But perhaps the most important thing that limits our sub-exposure time is saturation or clipping, especially if you're in a light polluted environment, because you're going to bring up all that light pollution and then you're going to add that signal to the signal for your object, and that could just saturate the detector, or it could drive it to where it's clipped, which is pretty much the same thing. You're going to lose detail at the bright end, and you don't want that to happen. So that is the main reason, that and tracking errors are the two main reasons you might want to limit your sub-exposure time. So the rule of thumb is it doesn't matter what your conditions are, as long as you don't saturate your target object or the interesting objects in your image, and there aren't other things like tracking errors, use the longest sub-exposure time you can. So with that simple formula, you no longer have to really ask what sub-exposure time I should use. I remember that the next time a newbie asks that question. The other thing to consider is idle time. It takes time to read out, and especially if people are dithering, it takes time to dither. So if you're imaging for 4 hours and you're doing short sub-exposures, then you're going to read out more often. You might possibly dither more often, although you can get around that by how you dither. So the shorter sub-exposures are going to mean in general that you're going to spend less time imaging and more time with the shutter closed. So during that 4 hours, you're not going to capture as much quality as you would if you had used longer exposures. So that's something a lot of people don't think about. Brings us right back. Use the longest exposures as the times that you can get away with. This is something that's come along in the last 5 years, and that is as they give us more and more gain selections, how do we determine the right gain setting to use? It used to be there was only one, and then there were 2 or 3, and now there can be 50 of them. So we need a way to determine the best gain setting. And SkyTools can do that now in version 4.1. This is what it looks like when you enter gain settings into SkyTools now. This is for a camera that has different modes. So for this one, this is a QHY 268M. For mode 3, setting 0, it's got a pretty big read noise, 5.7, but a very large full well. So you've got a bigger dynamic range. If you go down to mode 1, gain 56, it's got a much lower read noise, but a much smaller dynamic range. So the game you want to play here is always use the one with the lowest read noise, except that's going to lead to saturation and clipping. So it would be nice to know how much signal you're getting from your target object to know if you use this gain, whether the brighter parts are going to saturate or clip. And SkyTools can now make that calculation in version 4.1. So, and you notice these things are always in inverse relationship. The lowest read noise always has the lowest full well. And as you go up in higher read noise, you get more and more full well. So how do we determine the optimum game selection for CMOS camera? Well, there's 2 ways to control if there's a if the bright signal is saturating, and that's to change the sub-exposure time or to change the CMOS gain. So what SkyTools does is when it determines that time of night that is going to tell you to expose for that target in that filter, it's going to just run through all of them, every combination of sub-exposure time and gain, stack all of them together in an ongoing live stack, and determine the one that produced the most signal noise ratio at the end of that period. And so what you're really trying to do is, if you look at this image here, there's white here, but right in the middle, there's this brighter white. And if you were to push this image into saturation or clipping, saturation means that you've put as many electrons as will fit into a detector well. Clipping means you've put the maximum number that the camera can store in ADU into the memory, which is often 65,535, but on older cameras, it can be less. Then you're not going to be able to tell the difference between this white and that white. So you're going to lose this detail in the high ends. You don't want saturation or clipping. So putting all this together, how do we image smarter? The first is to choose targets that are well suited for your imaging system. That's a really smart thing to do. It can keep you from wasting a lot of time. Second thing is to image one filter at a time. Don't do it in a round robin. Don't do red, green, blue, red, green, blue, red, green, blue, unless you're doing something like photometry. Do all the reds at once, do all the greens in another time, do the blues in another time. That way you can do them when they're at their best and you get the most consistent data to stack. And by consistent, I mean the stars will be the same and the quality of the images will be the same. So you're also doing the most efficient imaging. And then try to maximize the signal to noise ratio that in the time you have available. And this is pretty much what SkyTools does when it's scheduling. It does everything it can to maximize the total signal to noise ratio for that one filter during that period of time. And then always use the longest practical sub-exposure time. And of course, the trick is to know what's practical. And in SkyTools, if you use SkyTools or whatever, I'll tell you there's a trick here. When you tell it what the longest practical sub-exposure time is, You set that up in your camera settings. If 10 minutes is too long, don't allow it to choose a 10-minute sub-exposure. And then it will choose the 5-minute or 6-minute or whatever you've allowed, if that's possible. And this is the one thing in Imaging Smarter that a lot of people have trouble with, because they're used to doing things one thing at a time. But get in the habit of imaging more than one project at a time. Have 2, 3, 4 projects going, and do parts of one night, parts of another night. And the reason for that is, if you're optimizing your filters, you might be able to image the rosette between 10 and 1. What do you do with, and you're going to get good, great, consistent images during that time. What do you do with the rest of the night? So you can help Sky Tools help you by allowing it to make a schedule that optimizes your images over multiple projects to take up more of the night. Because the alternative is you're going to go out there and you're going to image for the whole night on this project that's really at its best for 4 hours. And you're not going to end up with this high quality an image. You're going to end up throwing out some sub-exposures. So at this point, I want to talk about what's new in SkyTools Imaging 4.1 and do a little demo. There's some exposure tools like I showed earlier, that exposure table, but the Smart Project Builder is pretty cool. I'm going to show that here. So here's the SkyTools, excuse me, the SkyTools target selection tool. I'm going to right click and let's say I've decided to image the rosette. Choose the Smart Project Builder. This is the new tool. And I'm going to set that for the focal reducer. Yes, sir.
Yeah,
I should have been asking for questions along the way.
Yeah, Craig, we're still seeing your PowerPoint. You want to switch it, unshare and go back over to Sky Tools there.
Huh. That should be on top of it. You're not seeing anything on top of the PowerPoint?
Negative. I'd say just stop sharing and then share the Sky Tools.
Well, they're on the same window, which is what's
Yeah, but
confusing.
it depends. If you've got Zoom set up so that it only does an application as opposed to a window, it'll share the app and nothing else. So
okay, I thought I was being clever there. Oh, geez, I didn't want to leave the PowerPoint. Well, excuse me here for a minute. I'm going to do this. Oh, you know what? I'm going to move it to another window and share that one. Okay. Sorry for the delay. Share this window. All right, you seeing it now?
yes,
Okay.
we're good.
So I started with the Sky Tools. Yeah, hopefully there's not a problem that the resolution on this monitor isn't the same. But I started with the Sky Tools target selection tool. I decided that we were going to look at the rosette. I selected Smart Project Builder, opened that, set the focal reducer. And what this is going to do is we've got grayscale images selected. So we're just going to look at each filter individually. It's going to tell us what we can get under ideal conditions for 3 hours of total exposure on the rosette. So in the H alpha, for 3 hours, we're going to get a signal noise ratio of 50 in the brightest regions and 35 in the main part, which is pretty good. The O3, 37 and 25. And where is the S2? Oh, it's way down at the bottom because there's very little S2 in rosette. So this is telling us that we're only going to get a signal noise ratio of 3 in the main part of the nebula in our 3 hours. So what we can do is we can turn this around and switch to defining it by quality instead of time. How long would it take to reach an acceptable quality of 20? In the H alpha, it's going to take 60 minutes. So 12 5-minute exposures will get us to a quality of 20. In the O3, it'll take 24 5-minute exposures. So it's going to take 120 minutes. And way down here in the S2, is going to take 129 hours. So when you do your composite for this, you may want to just not do S2. A lot of people don't for the rosette. But if you really wanted to go for it, I mean, you could get a decent signal to noise ratio on 129 hours if you've got that much time. So let's look at what our choices are for color composites. So to get a signal noise ratio of 20 for the final image, we could do, these are all of our choices here. We could do an H alpha O3 color composite, just those two filters. It would take 6 hours because we're combining the 120 minutes and the 240 minutes in the H alpha and the O3. And we would get a signal noise ratio in the final color composite of 18. How do you make a color composite out of two filters? Well, you just make up a third channel, usually some sort of combination of those two filters, usually the green. Here's another one we could do. We could use broadband filters and LRB. That's going to take 25 hours though. Luminance H alpha O3, 32 hours. They're getting worse because as you go down, they get worse. If you try to do a Hubble palette, H alpha O3 and S2, it's going to take you 395 hours to get a signal noise ratio of 20 on your final color composite. And that's because you have to put so many hours into the S2 filter. So I hope you can see how this could be pretty useful in terms of planning. Excuse me. And then when you're done, you click Build Project. It will build an imaging project for you. And here are your exposure goals. And you can change this a little if you want. You can modify it however you want, but this is what's going to be observed. Almost 8 hours of exposure time in, I clicked on the wrong one. Anyhow, I don't know why I did that. Let's go up to the first one here, build it, get back on script here. Why is it doing that? I'm missing something here. Hold on, screwing up. H alpha O3. This is what happens when you use the version that you're actually working on. For some reason, it's not working right. Well, that's annoying. I should have used the release version for this. Oh, here we go. It just used the wrong name. Okay, so H alpha and O3, here are your filters, 2 hours and 4 hours. That's doable even on one night if it's up at the right time of night. And I should have been taking questions earlier, but getting late here. Once you have that, you can then put it into the scheduler. And I'm going to break my rule and just have one target for this night. Into the scheduler it goes, and it has scheduled it in this period of the night from here to here. So this is the so that funky name. This is the H alpha part here, and this is the O3 part there. I had it backwards. You needed less H alpha than O3. Anyhow, it schedules the best time to do it for that night. And that's the basic approach for the Smart Project Builder. Did anybody have any questions about the Smart Project Builder?
It's absolutely amazing. I hadn't realized you'd gotten this far with it. When we were doing some of your beta testing for you with Tarot, I hadn't realized you were working toward this toward the scheduler. This is really nice.
The second thing it can do, and this is super cool, is that I've set up this telescope control system to be Nina. So I'm going to click here and save a Nina sequence. So it's saved this sequence to Nina. And I can bring Nina up. It's over on the other monitor. And this is the advanced sequencer in Nina. And this is what I just exported. It's right here. And the basic idea is you make your own template for all your startup stuff. all your closing down, any of the housekeeping stuff you have to do that's not imaging, and I didn't include that in here. And then for the imaging parts, you just drag this over and drop it in, and you can drop in as many targets as you need, and it's just all there for Nina to go ahead and image those two filters for that target during the times of night that the scheduler determined. And one of the best things about this is the way it's designed is that if you get to it too late, or if you're interrupted, if you start it going, it'll just keep going to the end of that period of the night and then move on to the next one. So you'll get as much imaging as possible on each filter.
Hey, Greg?
Yeah.
There's two of us here that are very familiar with ACP. Michael Vandervorst over here is an ACP user.
Yeah.
And we've had ACP in Taro since it began.
Mhm.
I know that we did a little bit of testing where you beta testing with you with ACP. Do you have the same type of capability?
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
That's been built in from the beginning.
that's what I thought. Okay, this is
Yeah,
really
ACP, and it also will make it interfaces with ACP scheduler to create schedulers by figuring out the right constraints to use. And because people just tend to guess at those, but it can make an educated guess at those. Also, I'm getting reports. The other thing I included in this version 4.1 was the ability to create an export file, and I published the format. I talked to the people who do SGP and various other control systems, and they're currently working on implementing that format. So SGP will be able to read the output from this and do something similar. Nina is just so slick the way this works with the drag and the drop. And the fact that it's just simple because the two work together really well. Where like something like SGP wasn't designed to start imaging a filter at a certain time and then go until another time and then move to a different filter. That's not something it was ever meant to do. And to a certain extent, ACP it wasn't meant to do that either. You have to do all this estimating of how long everything's going to take, which takes some work to get it to work right. But with Nina, it's just all natural because it'll just go until the time. You can just tell it quit at 11, move on to the next filter, and that just makes it fantastic. Any other questions on that? Okay, so moving on to the last part. I have no idea how long I've been talking.
doesn't matter. We're still looking at SkyTools for imaging. I don't know what screen you want us to look at, but
yeah, I'm working on it. I'm thinking about what I want to do next. Probably change the share back to here.
while you're doing things there, as far as building up the database inside of SkyTools imaging, have you included databases for different filters for the Astrodon 2 series? Have you got that stuff built in?
Yeah, it's coming along all the time.
Okay.
A lot of it has been crowdsourced. People have done it. I have a digitizer. We live in a crazy golden age right now with cameras and filters. And I mean, if you went back 10 years and told people this is the way it was going to be, I think they would be amazed because there's so many manufacturers and so many choices. Are you seeing it say new in SkyTools 4.1 now? Is that what you're seeing?
Yes, I see PowerPoint. There's a new in SkyTools 4.1.
Okay.
Yes. And there's a rosette.
So the other thing I'm doing, and this is going to come out just in a few days, I'm really close to it being done, and just working on a couple of the bugs. Like you just saw a bug. Should never have used my development version for this, but is I'm doing a special update just for narrowband imaging, because it turns out that Nina has brought a lot of narrowband imagers into the fold because it's a favorite of the narrowband people. You could do narrowband imaging from your backyard with a significant amount of light pollution, and you get these really cool images as a result. But the problem with narrowband is that if you look at the professional astronomical catalog, there's no data. These things are all over the place. Nobody knows how strong the emission lines are from one object to the next, except for planetary nebulae, which is kind of funny because I actually took some of the data that goes into the planetary nebula database way back when I was a student at Mount Laguna. I was paid to do it, in fact. But so what I'm doing is I'm just leveraging the fact that I am trained as a professional astronomer, and I'm just going out and I'm measuring it. I'm using eye telescopes to do the measurements. So I'm making actual measurements of H alpha, O3, and S2, two emission lines, and then building that into a database, which then gets shoved back into SkyTools. So now, where an object like this one was, the monkey head was some of the least reliable data in the software, it's now some of the most reliable data in the software because it's been actually measured. We know the amount of H alpha, S2, and O3 for this image. So I'm going through and I'm measuring a bunch of those. I've got, I think, 25 in the first release. There'll probably be 50 in another couple of months, depending on the weather. And then I'm going to move to the southern hemisphere, add a bunch of those. But also, when you look at an object like this, they get very little attention from the professional community. Visual observers don't really care. When they look, they're going to see this bright knot. They're going to maybe see some of this. Hubble Space Telescope took a picture right in here. Just knowing what the monkey head is a little controversial. Some people think it's this knot. There are some people who think it's this knot, but the consensus seems to be it's the whole thing, which makes sense if you look at it. So cleaning all that up in the database to be consistent with what amateur imagers are doing today and getting the designations right. This is NGC 2175. This is NGC 2174, that kind of thing, required me to go in and fix all of these. So I'm fixing them as we go along because it just turns out that these are neglected objects in terms of just getting the NGCs right can be a problem because there's usually multiple ones and most people don't see in, when the NGC was created, it was created for visual observing. People don't see in O3, right? So that's coming out soon. And the very last thing I want to talk about is EAA. It's getting very hot these days. And when I separated imaging from visual, I broke EAA because it uses the technology of long exposure imaging, but it really needs the workflow of visual observing. And so what I'm going to do is, that's my next big project for version 4.1 of SkyTools Visual. And it may sound a little weird, but I'm going to put the electronic assisted astronomy into SkyTools Visual Pro Edition, probably by the fall. And that will make it simple, because long exposure imaging is a big deal, as we just saw. It's a very technical thing. People who are doing EAA aren't that interested in the technical aspects. They're not using fixed insight. They're not using multiple narrowband filters and that sort of a thing. So I'm going to blend it in with the visual, so people will just choose their camera as if it's another eyepiece, stick it on there, and SkyTools Visual will do all the magic that it does now, but it'll work for your camera and maybe tell you some things like how many images you need to stack to get a good looking image, that sort of thing. But it'll be just fairly basic. So that's the plan for SkyTools imaging, visual, and EAA. And boy, do I get asked a lot about this these days. And that's pretty much all I got. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, okay, and you and I had talked a little bit about this thing that I'm working with at the Calvé Observatory.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I kind of mucked around and said, hey, let's go figure out if we can do this ASI 6200 and what it looks like. And the stuff that we came up with actually works pretty well.
Huh.
It works pretty well based on the fact that this delta rho, so it was the ASI 6200 on the back of this plane wave delta rho 350. The downside is this this really, really great observatory is underneath a huge pocket of sky pollution.
Yeah,
So it actually, I don't know, I'll see if I can pull up the picture, but it worked, at least the initial calculations that we came up with worked really well. As far as being able to make a picture and say, okay, all that fun stuff, as far as the numbers you came up with, as far as the looking at
that's
the,
cool.
yeah, no, it worked really
Well,
well.
you know, when it supports it specifically, you know, you'll have the right field of views and you'll have, you know, a rectangle on the screen
Yeah,
instead of an eyepiece, and it will accurately tell you which things are easy to get a view in your EAA setup. With that telescope, it'd probably be just about anything except for the light pollution. But you put a
Yeah.
light pollution filter on there, and you know, maybe in one of these multi-band, narrowband filters
Yeah.
or something like that.
Do you think at some point, in time, you're going to be able to put that in there as far as Optolong now makes this thing called the
Oh, yeah.
quadband?
You can already do that in SkyTools imaging.
Okay,
Since it's just a graph of the transparency of the filter,
yeah,
it can be anything. So yeah, we have those already. You know, and it supports color DSLR imaging,
Yeah.
things like that. That's the kind of thing that people put those filters on, and it works pretty well.
wow, phenomenal. I'm really very impressed. I've been using SkyTools 3 since she came out with it, and before that SkyTools 4 or 2. But SkyTools 3 was always kind of the everything that I'd ever done as far as as far as go-to imaging. This is really phenomenal. Typically, the narrowband stuff that we do with the Taro Observatory, I go 30 minutes as far as exposures on 3 nanometer filters. So I'm assuming that your database has, if I plug in or go and say, hey, I've got a filter that's an HA filter that's got a 3 nanometer passband. That's all included as part of the database.
Right. It's just a matter of having the right one.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, you got to have those really narrow ones if you're working with light pollution. It makes a big difference.
Yeah, it does. And the gentleman who donated all this gear to the club, to the observatory, his plan, his hero was Jay Gabani. If you remember, Jay discovered the galactic tidal streams because he was where Jay had his telescope at. He was doing these long exposures, and Terry Arnold, the guy who donated the gear, his goal was to do some scientific imaging, and what he did was to spend a significant amount of coin on these 3 nanometer Astrodon filters, including an N2 filter, because a 3 nanometer HA filter tends to lose detail, and his plan was to take an N2 filter and put it up next to it, so he got back some of that detail. But so that was the overall golden plan he was going to work on. We haven't used the N2 filters very much, but
yeah, I don't currently have. I don't have any telescopes that are easily accessible to me making measurements in the N2 filters.
Yeah.
But it's a good start to do the main 3.
Yes, yeah, and that's kind of where everything's at. So yeah, we've kind of defaulted and said, okay, so and I know that in looking through some of the stuff in the past, you had said there was a discussion online, and that was one of the questions I was going to ask. Do you take into account binning? So if I wanted to do 2x2 binning on O3 to match it up, is that part of the plan? Is that automatic to be able to do that?
Yeah, I was going to do that in my demo, but I skipped over it. You just switch the binning. Yeah, it's just a simple change internally in the camera.
And as far as from the aspect of automated, so if I go set up an imaging plan on a specific object and say, okay, does SkyTools come back and say, oh, you want to use 2x2 imaging on the oxygen side. Is that part of what you've been able to come up with, or is that just a decision that the user makes and says, yeah,
No,
probably?
well, remember the Smart Project Builder?
Yes.
It'll give that, it tries to give as many possible options as possible.
Mhm.
And so it does interesting things with the exposures. A simple thing you can do is just divide it for each of them, but you could weight the number of exposures for the filter with the least signal, all that kind of thing, trying to get you the best situation. So that list will just keep getting longer and longer. And one of the things it does is it gives you the option of, let's say, do an LRGB image, and the RGB will be 2 times bend and the L will be 1 time.
Oh,
And you'll be able to see what the final result will be in terms of signal to noise ratio, at least.
Okay.
Some people don't like doing that, but I think it all depends on how you process it.
yes.
If you look at the color as just sort of coloring,
Well, yeah, it's
not detail. And if you do it right,
it's filler. I mean, realistically, you think that your luminance channel is giving you the detail within inside of your subject, if you will.
right?
And yeah, no, it's very definite. Hey, Michael Vandervorst, what questions you got? Because you've been doing this for a while. And you're using ACP, I know you are. So unmute and ask some questions, buddy. See if he comes back. Michael actually has the first automated observatory at Terra del Sol. And he's been imaging. His images are outstanding. And I know he's an ACP user as well. I know he's unmuted. Maybe he's asking questions. Dorothy or AC, you guys got some questions?
No, I don't have anything right now.
The concept of optimizing in SkyTools 4 looks just outstanding. It looks really slick. I'm anxious to get my hands on 4.1 just because of the build that the scheduler builder that's in there looks just really, really cool.
Yeah. It filled a gap that was, in a lot of ways, 4.1 is version 2, 4.0 of imaging is version 1.
Uh-huh.
So there's always a lot of room for improvement between version 1 and 2 of something.
Wow.
So I think that it brings it a long ways. It makes things that should have been easy that weren't easy.
Yeah, I do have a question. Have you done any work on automatic focusing like SkyX does?
It's not required for what SkyTools does.
Yeah.
So yeah, SkyTools just does the planning. It just tells you when to image in which filter. And I get, when it first came out, I got a lot of pushback. People said, why doesn't it work with SGP? Why doesn't it work with this? And I would say, well, how are you using SGP now? And they were typing in all the different things. And I said, well, just look at what the scheduler says and type that in.
Type that in, yeah, yeah.
Oh, but that didn't go over real well. So I'm glad that supporting Nina, for instance, just totally fills that gap. People do want an automated kind of system.
Yeah. Now, and Nina, there's been quite a few folks in the club that have adopted Nina as the way to do it. That seems to be one of the absolute top end way people are going, especially the open source portion of that thing.
It works pretty well, and it's getting better all the time. And that's always the bottom line for that sort of software. How much time does it spend not working? And does it work for everybody's system? Does it cover everybody's camera? What are the gotchas? Because there are a lot of them for that business.
Mm-hmm.
But most people seem to be happy with it, but most of them seem to be backyard narrowband imagers. That's really where it's taken off.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of noticeable. People have figured out, A, there's narrowband, B, I can do it from my backyard. And you've got Optilong that's come in and kind of put in, a single filter you can put in front of a color camera that
Yeah.
does narrowband imaging without,
Yeah.
without having to do the hassles of a filter wheel or something along that line.
Right.
I'm starting to see a lot of that as far
Yep.
as people who do that. It's true. It's like, wow, cool. CMOS cameras and notch filters for one shot color is really opening things up. It's quite amazing.
Yep.
B, you got questions?
Just sitting here taking it all in, Dave.
Very cool. That is it's outstanding. Thank you very much. I'll tell you a little bit at some point in time. I'll contact you what's going on with Calaway and with stuff that we've started out. I'm pretty sure they're going to go ahead and purchase a license for that. There are some limitations that I've run into, but I'll talk to you about that later. But yeah, it's outstanding stuff.
Thanks.
Hey, there's Mike. Hey, Mike. I can see it going chatty. I don't hear your microphone. Oh, well, can't ask any questions. Mike Vandervorst is a very long time imager. He's been doing this for a long time. And his images he comes out are just spectacular stuff. So, he looks like he's trying to get something going here. Ken, you got some questions here?
I was just playing around with the advanced exposure calculator. If you get a little asterisk blooming, so is there an easy way to have that go away, or you just incrementally work down your exposure time, your sub-exposure?
Yeah, you just want to lower the exposure time until it goes away. Although a lot of times these days, I mean, you're going to have to put up with some blooming on bright stars and things like that. Well, of course, blooming is different from saturation. It's actually kind of hard to calculate, especially for CMOS cameras these days. I'm not sure how accurate it actually is these days. But blooming is when it really starts to look obvious, when bad things are happening to your image because that star is so saturated that it's leaking all over the place. So you probably want to avoid blooming if you can. But a lot of times there's a really bright star in the field and it's going to bloom, and you just have to put up with it if you want to get the fainter detail of the nebula.
Another question if you go to the interactive atlas, go to the camera view, and you kind of get a representation. Could be better, could be worse, depending on the object. On previous versions, you put little vertical red lines.
Yeah.
On stars that would bloom. I don't
They're
think
still there.
Is it still there?
Did they go away?
They went away on mine. Maybe I'll have to force it to bloom and see if they're there.
Yeah, try longer exposures,
Yeah, try.
brighter stars.
Yeah.
So I found it rather interesting when you said that there's no such thing as an exposure time that's too long. The guy that I run this observatory with, we did some initial testing and said that, 30 minutes on narrowband exposures is about as long as we can get without the signal to noise ratio starting to climb. It kind of sounds like that really isn't necessarily the case.
No, and you want it to climb though. So I'm not sure what that meant.
Oh, well, it's this at some point beyond 30 minutes, Jeff, the guy that I work with, had said, no, the sky noise becomes more prevalent. The signal to noise ratio starts to fall off after a certain point.
As what becomes more prevalent?
Signal to noise, as the signal to noise, the light pollution.
Oh, you said sky noise. No.
The sky noise becomes
No, not in my calculations and in the testings I've done to test the calculations. I suppose there could be some edge cases, but I don't see what they would be. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
You're gonna get, longer your exposure, the
That's-
more
yeah.
sky noise you're gonna get, but
But the benefits as far as improving the signal to noise ratio are better the longer you go.
well, I'll tell you, there is a related issue here that, I've done what I hate, which is I've oversimplified some things. If you're doing 30-minute exposure, did you say 30-minute
30
exposure?
minutes, yeah, 30 minutes, yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
how many of those are you going to be able to stack when you're done?
We
Well-
usually,
That was a rhetorical question.
well, it's, the answer is that if I go for 20 hours on, so it's not uncommon to put anywhere between 10 and 20 hours on each narrowband
Okay.
filter for what we
So
look
let's say you're doing 20 hours.
at. Yeah,
If you're doing 30-minute exposures,
Mhm.
then you're going to have 40 images to stack.
yeah,
Well, let's say you're doing 10 hours.
Okay.
You're only going to have 20 images to stack. And this is where I think is what he's talking about, because you still need lots of images to stack. And if you start getting into smaller numbers of images to stack, then you start to lose the advantages of the long exposures. Most people don't do 30-minute exposures. That's pretty long. It's crazy you can get away with that.
oh, we can, I mean, it definitely can, the guiding on this particular system. So we're imaging at 0.7 of an arc second per pixel. Typically, our RMS guiding on this system is around 0.2 pixels, 0.2 to 0.4 pixels.
That's nice.
So the system is stable enough that it'll image if we need to. If you look at the PSF on the system, it's, it stays pretty much at about, I don't know, 3 point something, 3.8, no matter what you're doing with the thing. It'll run for 30 minutes without an issue.
Wow.
We just kind of said, okay, so at 30 minutes, if you say it's running for 30 minutes and something goes through and screws up the image, or it bumps, or the wind blows too hard, and you
Right.
basically tossed out a half an hour worth of data.
Right. And that becomes a real issue.
Yeah,
What
so
I'd want to do if I were you, and if I had that system, is I'd want to go through the trouble to get it into SkyTools, and then look at that exposure table and see, for my actual conditions, for my actual filter and my telescope, light pollution and all that, what the effect actually is, because it may well be that the difference between a 15-minute exposure, some exposure, and a 30 is minimal,
yeah, no, I can say that, yeah.
especially because that calculation does not take into account finite numbers of images to be stacked.
Mhm.
That's where it kind of goes wrong. So if you're only stacking two 10-minute exposures, you're not going to get as good a result as if you're stacking 10 of them.
Mhm.
But in my example that I did, it still had a big impact. It still made a big difference versus the 60-second exposures.
Yeah,
I think the main thing is a lot of people are in the habit of doing really short exposures. And sometimes they have to, because the light pollution is so bad that anything over 60 seconds means that, everything's going to be saturated. But people are getting around that with these filters now. So
Yep.
it's more like you're imaging someplace dark.
yep.
Ooh.
Uh-oh, what was that noise, Ken?
No, I was playing with what Greg told us to do. I'm on the advanced exposure calculator for some arbitrary objects. And the recommendation was to take sub-exposures of 300 seconds, which I would do most of the time. Remember, the other part of the equation is you've got a dark library, and you'd rather take subs that match your dark library than some.
Right. True.
But so I
Of course, you
did
could pick your dark library to fit what works out best for your.
Yeah, so
typically.
you've got a range, but
Yeah.
so what I did was, and it wanted me to take 300 seconds in the calculate required exposure time. But when I went over, but then it said blooming, so I went over calculate signal to noise for exposure and started reducing the sub-exposure time, keeping the total time constant, and got it down. I eliminated the blooming, and I got brightest regions saturated. So it is calculating.
Yeah, okay. You're down into the saturation.
Yeah, well, you know,
I don't think I've ever done that before.
well, it's just, you know, this is on the
Yeah.
Vail West.
Next will be clipping.
Yeah, next there'll be clipping, huh?
Yeah.
30 seconds. Yeah, this is kind of fun. And that's actually how I use it.
Hmm.
No, I got rid of all of it.
Okay.
If I go to 30-second subs, I still get a signal to noise of 26, which it makes a pretty good image.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, as a matter of fact, that's how I use it. I pick a target for the night, go in and the exposure calculator and try to figure out what it would take.
I think the smart project builder would be quicker.
Probably would be. I don't get the smart project builder. I get the project builder. If I click on an object,
You want to share your screen, Ken, and show them what you're doing?
remember I'm on a Mac.
Oh,
And
well,
this thing doesn't run on a Mac. So I click on it. Well, no, I got the smart project builder that time. I'm sorry, I take it back. It says smart project builder, and it says, and did it agree with all the other calculations? I'm assuming that all these things agree behind the.
It depends. I mean, there's a difference between those two tools. One of them considers optimum conditions, and the other one considers the actual conditions. And the exposure calculator, if you start at midnight and you tell it what the weather is, it'll take that into account.
The smart project builder would have me take 180 1-minute exposures. I think I would take the.
Well,
I think I would take a shorter.
Well, that's not the job of the smart project builder, though, because the idea of the smart project builder is to help you pick what filters you want to use and to build your project. Then you put it in the scheduler, and the scheduler looks at that exact time of night under those conditions. What's the moon doing? How high is it? And only then does it pick the right gain and exposure time.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That was key. So typically what I would do is going to have a target tonight. We're going to image about 4 hours. Pick one, go to the exposure calculator, figure out what would be a good set of exposures. And total.
You can let the scheduler do that for you.
Yeah, how do you say the scheduler do that for me? I don't know how to do that.
Scheduler is the core of the product, really. It's the most important part.
I know your workflow is different than my workflow. I've realized that for some time.
Michael Vandervorst, you got any questions you want to put in the chat window? Since your microphone was I can see you smiling away and your microphone is useless. No questions. All right, guys. Let me stop this.